the destruction of our country's past as well as our future at the moment. You know, it is now so popular, so progressive, to be ashamed of Australia's modern history. And we're sure seeing that this week. Wednesday will be 250 years since Captain James Cook did something incredible, heroic, history-changing. This sailor from England landed on Botany Bay, the first white man to land on that side of our continent, as part of an incredible voyage in which he became the first man to map all New Zealand's coast and then the eastern coast of Australia. An astonishing feat of navigation, which Australia claimed for Britain as well. 8 years later, Britain sent convicts and soldiers to settle in Botany Bay, although they quickly moved to better land at Sydney Cove. And from that, this modern Australian nation of both Aborigines and non-Aborigines together was born. And look around you. It's pretty good. This terrific society. Look back in history, you won't find one that was richer and freer. We live like kings, coronavirus apart. But this achievement fills the left with shame. Cook's statues have been repeatedly vandalised by protesters claiming he was an agent of genocide. And the Greens want no celebration of James Cook this week.
Is not being honest about the dark sides of Australia's history. The more that we continue to have these celebrations, the further away we are from healing as a country.
And this ludicrous shame has percolated right through the cultural institutions, including our schools. 50 years ago, on the 200th anniversary, there were all kinds of celebrations of James Cook, like reenactments of his voyage. Even the Queen came out to Australia.
We celebrate James Cook's voyage of discovery.
But even allowing for the coronavirus now, the lack of commemoration of this 250th anniversary is amazing. Joining me a short while ago was Australia's greatest historian, Geoffrey Blainey, whose countless fine books now include another, Captain Cook's Epic Voyage. Geoffrey Blainey, thank you so much for joining me. Should we be ashamed of Captain James Cook?
No, we should be proud of him. He made one of the great voyages in the history of exploration. He charted the east coast of Australia. He landed at Botany Bay and Cooktown. It's one of the great voyages in world history and one of the great events in Australian history. We can be proud of it. We can understand if Aborigines want to protest, they have a right to protest, but we should celebrate it, all Australians.
I'll get back to that later on, but first tell us something about James Cook's early life. He was born the son of a Yorkshire farmer. He then worked in a grocer's shop, sleeping underneath the counter at night, before he went to, I think, Whitby it was, in the Yorkshire coast, and started learning a little bit about sailing on coal ships going down to London. It hardly seems an auspicious beginning for one of the great navigators of world history.
No, it's a very humble beginning. There was a great coal trade between Yorkshire and London. London was the great consumer of coal in the world, and he began his life as an apprentice on a coal ship and was offered the role of captain when very young, but he decided to join the Royal Navy, and he served in the British War against the French in Canada, and he became very skilled at surveying, skilled at navigation, but he was a person really of no importance when the time came to look for somebody to captain a ship, a tiny ship on a voyage around the world.
And originally the idea was that he'd be sent out to monitor the transit of Venus, an astrological phenomenon, going to Hawaii, and only then he opened his secret orders, and it said, go and try and discover the southern continent. What was the story there? What were the British actually wanting him to do? What were they hoping he'd find?
It was Tahiti actually. Tahiti, and he was told that when he'd completed his surveying on the day of the transit of Venus, he should take his ship south and look for a missing continent. It was believed then that somewhere in the Pacific was a huge continent, the idea being that why should there be so much land in the northern hemisphere and so little land in the southern hemisphere? And it was widely believed then that somewhere in the vastness of the Pacific Ocean was this great continent, probably inhabited with all kinds of exotic products. It was also widely believed that there was a Jewish colony there. They were great traders, and therefore they would show Cook what items could be traded. So he set out from Tahiti on this voyage far to the south in the hope that he would find this continent that all around the world people believed would someday be found.
Now, what's remarkable reading his diaries is that he notes fires along the coast, maybe campfires or more, I don't know. But also, it struck me in a couple of diary entries, he noted almost zero interest from Aborigines who saw the ship, which to them must have been the first time they'd ever seen such a thing, probably the first time they've ever seen white men, and total lack of interest. No engagement, just walking on past. What was this story of his interaction with Aborigines during this voyage?
Well, that is astonishing, isn't it? Here are Aborigines walking along the beach. This ship, unlike anything they had ever seen, sailing past with its high sails, and there's no sign that they looked at it. It's curious, isn't it, whether they thought it was an enemy, and you don't look at the enemy in case he decides that he'll attack you, but that happened quite often in Cook's voyages along the coast. Aborigines could be seen, perhaps carrying spears, perhaps carrying a tiny canoe, but taking no interest whatsoever in the ship from the outside world. It is astonishing, I do agree.
Now, his leadership was amazing. His navigation skills were incredible, as were his map-making skills. He was an amateur scientist as well. Also a great leader of men in the sense that he kept them healthy. He detected that eating greens or spinach or whatever, or sauerkraut, would keep his crew free from scurvy, their teeth falling out and perhaps dying. All that was amazing. Can he, though, on the other side, be blamed, as some now seek to do, as an agent of genocide?
Well, I think genocide is an unwise word, a silly word to use about Australia. Cook thought well of the Aborigines. He admired their very simple way of life. He wished them no harm, although just occasionally there were clashes, but he had no wish to do harm to the Aborigines. We forget that on the basis of Cook's reports and Banks' reports when they returned to England, the English government eventually decided to make a colony in Botany Bay or Sydney Harbour, and they did so with every intention of having no clashes with the Aborigines, but it was a most difficult confrontation. Here was a nation which had just invented the steam engine during the Industrial Revolution, face to face with people who had no pottery and couldn't boil water. You know, intelligent and adaptable people, the Aborigines, but a completely different attitude to land, to kinship, to diet, to so many different things. There was no way in the world that they could get on together at the start, so that from the very beginning the settlement in Sydney was fraught with difficulties. Eventually there was fighting, but and considerable numbers of Aborigines were killed in the next 100 years, but the number of Aborigines who were killed were tiny compared to the others who died of diseases to which they had no immunity: smallpox, whooping cough, influenza, and so on. I mean, disease was probably the greatest killer of Aborigines, far more than fighting. And we forget that the Aborigines themselves were a fighting people, and that before the Europeans came, there were many clashes between different Aboriginal groups, often with very large casualties. You could easily use the word genocide of some of those clashes between two Aboriginal groups, but the word is completely unfair. The word belongs to Hitler's Germany, and it's really got no place in Australian history, in my view.
Now, on Monday last week was the 250th anniversary of the sighting, as you said, of Point Hicks, the first sighting by Cook's crew of Australia. On Wednesday, it'll be the 250th of the landing at Botany Bay. There was no celebrations at all last Monday. I doubt there'll be any or many at all next Wednesday. What do you make of that? Should we be celebrating?
It's Captain Cook's voyage along the east coast of Australia is at least one of the 2 or 3 most important events in Australian history. Imagine the United States not celebrating the landing of the Pilgrim Fathers. I find it incomprehensible. I can quite perfectly understand Mr. Morrison and Mr. Dan Andrews, the Premier of Victoria, not taking time off. Why should they? But it seems to me elementary that if they can't come, you send the Governor-General or the Governor or the head of the Navy. Nothing was done and there was no ceremony at Point Hicks. I really think that is a sad oversight, and it shouldn't happen in other events along the Australian coast in the next few months.
Professor Geoffrey Blainey, thank you so much indeed for your time.